You know, usually when we talk about making a change, whether that means pivoting the strategy at your company or trying to introduce a new dynamic into a relationship or even just attempting to reorganize your own kitchen, there is this incredibly pervasive expectation of logic.
Right. Absolutely.
We treat human behavior like it's, engineering. You
Yeah.
look at a system, you identify an inefficiency, you draw up a mathematically superior blueprint,
Yep.
and then you point to the new layout and you say, look, I have solved the problem. This is objectively better.
We cling to that rational model because, well, it gives us a sense of control. We desperately want to believe that if you just present a compelling enough argument armed with sufficient data and, undeniable facts, people will naturally discard their old ways and embrace the improvement.
It feels clean.
Exactly. It feels clean. It feels binary.
Broken or not broken, inefficient or efficient. But then you take that beautiful logical blueprint and you step out into the actual world of human behavior.
And it all falls apart.
It completely falls apart. Suddenly, that blueprint isn't just ignored. It is actively set on fire. We find ourselves navigating a psychological landscape that just defies all logic.
I mean, you present the facts, and instead of gratitude for the improvement, you are met with pure, unadulterated hostility.
Which leaves the reformer feeling utterly bewildered. You find yourself thinking, why are they fighting me? I am making their lives easier. I'm fixing the very thing they complain about.
But you've stumbled blindly into a psychological minefield.
So if you have ever been an entrepreneur trying to pivot a startup, a middle manager rolling out new software, or honestly, just someone trying to get your family to change a stubbornly entrenched holiday tradition, you know this wall of inexplicable resistance.
You have definitely bruised your forehead against it.
Today, we're going to figure out exactly why that wall exists. And more importantly, we are going to look at the blueprint of how the most powerful, consequential people in history have navigated around it, dismantled it, or, used it to their advantage.
It's a really vital skill set.
Our source material for this deep dive is a fascinating excerpt analyzing Law 45 from the 48 Laws of Power. The law itself is stated simply: preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once.
A very deceptive little sentence.
Right. Our mission today is to uncover the hidden psychological tripwires of human habit so you can enact massive transformations without getting your proverbial head chopped off.
Or, as we will see very shortly, your literal head. Because the penalty for misunderstanding this specific quirk of human psychology is historically quite severe.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core text presents us with a fundamental paradox about human nature. It's a duality that lives inside you, inside me, inside everyone listening.
What is that duality?
On the surface level, people vocally demand novelty. We get bored easily. We understand intellectually that institutions stagnate and need renewal. We love to complain about the status quo and declare that we need a fresh start.
But that vocal desire for change is completely genuine only on the surface. It exists in the abstract.
Right, abstractly we love it.
Because when we say we want change, what we usually mean is that we want the benefits of a new system. But we unconsciously expect the emotional landscape of our daily lives to remain exactly the same.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
You want a revolution that doesn't actually require us to alter our morning routine.
And that is the paradox. Because deep down, on a cellular day-to-day level, we are absolute creatures of habit. If you introduce a change that actually upsets our core routines, we don't just get annoyed.
We freak out.
We totally freak out. We experience a profound, disproportionate psychological disturbance.
To understand why that reaction is so intense, we have to look at the psychological root the text exposes. I mean, human history is, and always has been, defined by insecurity and threat.
Surviving was hard.
Exactly. For thousands of years, the world outside the cave was chaotic, unpredictable, and deadly. So to cope with that overwhelming existential dread, humans developed a coping mechanism. We latch onto the familiar.
We create habits.
We build elaborate rituals. We attach deep emotional significance to the faces, the spaces, and the routines we know. These structures act as a psychological fortress. They make a terrifying random universe feel ordered and safe.
So when a manager comes in and says, we are throwing out the old filing system, they think they're just optimizing a workflow.
But the human animal doesn't experience it as a workflow optimization. When you destroy the familiar, you don't instantly replace it with a comforting new system. You create a void.
A void?
Yes. You create a sudden vacuum where the comforting ritual used to be. And human psychology recoils from that vacuum in absolute terror. Unconsciously, the text argues, we associate that sudden void with chaos. We associate it with death.
Wow. You are stripping away the very structures that keep their existential dread at bay.
Precisely.
That reframes everything. It explains why people will sabotage their own success just to protect a broken system they happen to be familiar with. Which brings us to the guiding metaphor of the text, and it perfectly encapsulates this irrationality. The text asks us to consider the psychology of a cat.
It is the ultimate embodiment of this dynamic.
Think about how a cat operates. A cat is the patron saint of habit. It finds its sunbeams, it learns the exact topography of the furniture, it knows precisely how the house smells. The environment is its map of safety.
This sensory map is everything.
Now, suppose you have to move the cat. You pack up, you move to a new house, and you buy completely new, objectively nicer furniture. You have provided an upgrade. Does the cat appreciate the new upholstery?
No, it loses its mold.
It goes completely unmanageable. It hides under the sofa. It refuses to eat. It lashes out. It goes borderline psychotic.
Because its sensory map has been obliterated. The cat doesn't possess the logic to say, this is a better neighborhood and the square footage is larger. All the cat registers is the terrifying absence of the familiar, the void.
So how do you handle the cat? The text gives very specific advice. If change is necessary, if you absolutely must move to the new house, you have to deceive the cat.
You have to manufacture an illusion of continuity.
Exactly. You take the old, ratty, scratched-up blanket that smells deeply of the previous house, and you strategically place it in the corner of the new living room. You surround the cat with familiar objects. You anchor it in the new reality by rigorously maintaining the scent of the past.
And this specific deception, preserving the smells of the past to mask the terror of the new, is the lens through which we are going to examine our historical figures today.
I love this framing.
We're going to look at visionaries who possessed incredible, world-changing ideas. Some of them brutally spooked the cat and paid the ultimate price. Others recognized the power of the old blanket, completely rearranged the architecture of society, and had the masses thanking them for it.
So if the penalty for ignoring the psychology is so severe, let's start by looking at a man who fundamentally misunderstood the cat. Let's look at what happens when you arrogantly assume that a logical, efficient solution is enough to carry the day. We are traveling back to Tudor England, specifically the 1520s and 1530s.
To set the historical stage properly, we have to understand the sheer magnitude of the crisis facing King Henry VIII. It wasn't just a personal marital dispute. It was an existential threat to the entire Tudor dynasty.
Because he didn't have a male heir.
Right. Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for years, but she has not produced a living male heir. And in the 1520s, a kingdom without a clear succession is a kingdom practically inviting civil war. The War of the Roses was still a relatively fresh cultural memory.
So Henry believes he needs a new wife, and he has set his sights on the young Anne Boleyn.
He has a clear goal: get a divorce, marry Anne, produce a male heir, secure the dynasty.
But he is blocked by the largest institutional wall in the known world, the Catholic Church. Pope Clement VII categorically refuses to annul the marriage.
And the Pope isn't just saying no, he is threatening Henry with excommunication.
Which was a massive deal.
A huge deal. In this era, excommunication means the Pope is declaring to the world that Henry's soul is damned, and furthermore, that it's perfectly legal for any rival Catholic monarch to invade England and depose him.
It's political and spiritual checkmate. Henry turns to his most powerful minister, Cardinal Wolsey, to solve this impossible problem. But Wolsey is a creature of the church. He gives only half-hearted support to the king's divorce efforts, failing to grasp the true desperation of Henry's position.
And Wolsey's failure to navigate this crisis cost him his power, his wealth, and ultimately his life. The message to the court is clear: how to solve the king's problem or perish.
Enter Thomas Cromwell. Now, Cromwell's background is crucial here. He is not a nobleman. He is the son of a blacksmith and a brewer from Putney. He's a self-made man who has risen through sheer competence, intellect, and ruthlessness.
He is an outsider looking at a stagnant, entrenched system.
And Cromwell looks at the Pope's refusal and offers a solution that is so radical, so staggering in its scope, that it almost defies comprehension for the time.
The audacity of Cromwell's proposal cannot be overstated. He tells the king, if the Pope won't grant the divorce, we simply remove the Pope from the equation. We sever the entirety of England from Rome.
Just cut them out entirely.
We dismantle the authority of the Catholic Church within our borders, and we declare you, King Henry, the supreme head of a newly formed Church of England. As the head of your own church, you can grant your own divorce.
From a purely strategic standpoint, it is a masterstroke. It cuts the Gordian knot, it solves the succession crisis, it removes a massive foreign power from English politics, and it centralizes absolute authority in the monarchy.
Henry's is euphoric.
Hmm.
By 1531, he realizes Cromwell has given him the keys to the kingdom. He elevates this blacksmith's son to his inner council.
Cromwell delivers the divorce. Henry marries Anne Boleyn. Problem solver.
If Cromwell had stopped there, he might have died peacefully in his bed as a celebrated statesman. But Cromwell was not merely a pragmatic problem solver for the king. He was a visionary.
He had his own agenda.
He was deeply influenced by the emerging Protestant Reformation on the continent. He looked at the vast, sprawling, incredibly wealthy apparatus of the Catholic Church in England and saw corruption, inefficiency, and superstition. He wanted a completely new order.
And here's where Cromwell begins to severely transgress Law 45. He decides to reform too much, too fast. In 1534, Cromwell initiates what is essentially a massive national audit. He sends his agents and commissioners out across the country to survey the monasteries, the abbeys, and the convents.
When the reports come back, the staggering reality of the church's wealth becomes clear. For centuries, people had been leaving land, gold, and treasure to these institutions to secure prayers for their souls. The church controlled an astonishing percentage of the wealth of the entire nation.
So Cromwell realizes he can not only reform the religion, but he can seize this unprecedented wealth to fund the king's ambitions and solidify the new Protestant state. So Cromwell fires up the propaganda machine. He needs a justification for the demolition he is about to unleash. He circulates salacious reports detailing the corruption, the sexual impropriety, and the financial abuses happening inside the monasteries.
He paints them as parasitic institutions bleeding the country dry. Armed with this justification, the hammer falls. Cromwell begins the dissolution of the monasteries.
We have to pause here and truly examine the sensory and psychological impact of what Cromwell did, because it perfectly illustrates the terror of the void. We cannot look at this merely as a transfer of property deeds. Cromwell didn't just pass laws, he physically dismantled the reality of the English people.
Picture what a monastery meant to an average citizen in a rural shire in 1535. It wasn't just a building where monks chanted in Latin, it was the absolute center of gravity for their entire existence.
It was the only hospital for 50 miles.
Right. If you felt destitute, the monastery was the only place that would give you bread. It was the inn for travelers. It was the school. It was the archive that held the records of your family's births and deaths. The daily ringing of its bells dictated the rhythm of your workday.
And suddenly, Cromwell's men arrive. They don't just close the doors. They strip the lead off the roofs so the buildings will rapidly decay and cannot be reoccupied. They seize the gold chalices your ancestors donated.
They smash the relics of the saints you have prayed to since childhood.
The visual destruction was visceral. Imagine watching the magnificent stained glass windows of your local abbey windows that served as the visual Bible for an illiterate populace being shattered onto the cobblestones.
The sensory map is obliterated. The smells of the past, the incense, the familiar Latin liturgy, the predictable cycle of feast days, they are outlawed. Overnight, the rituals that provided psychological comfort in a brutal world are criminalized. Anyone caught practicing the old ways is branded a heretic.
And the economic fallout is catastrophic. By destroying the monasteries, Cromwell annihilated the social safety net. Suddenly, thousands of former monks and nuns are turned out into the elements. The poor and sick, who relied on monastic charity, flood the roads. The beggar class explodes.
And then he raised taxes, right?
In an act of supreme political tone deafness, yes, Cromwell actually raises taxes on the common people to fund these very reforms.
Okay, I have to step in here and play defense for Cromwell, because I know there are listeners who manage large teams or departments who might sympathize with him. Look at the balance sheet. Cromwell identified a massive inefficiency. The church was hoarding wealth while the state needed funds. He executed the king's will flawlessly.
He did.
He consolidated power. He modernized the state apparatus. By the metrics of pure administrative logic, Cromwell achieved a massive victory. Why did this brilliant logical restructuring backfire so spectacularly?
To answer that, the text offers a brilliant analogy from the world of physics. It says that Cromwell hit the billiard ball too hard against the cushion.
Explain the mechanics of that.
When you are playing billiards and you strike the cue ball with maximum violent force, you might successfully sink your intended target. Cromwell certainly sank the divorce and the break with Rome. But when you apply that much blunt force to a complex system, You cannot foresee the caroms.
The ricochets.
Exactly. The cue ball ricochets violently off 3 other cushions, scatters the rest of the balls into unpredictable chaos, and often results in you scratching the shot entirely.
He didn't just upset the cat's routine, he drove a bulldozer through the living room.
Precisely. Cromwell arrogantly believed that because his vision was correct and efficient, the common people would eventually see the light. He knew the transition would cause pain, but he assumed the emotional reaction would fade once they realized the new system was superior.
He completely misjudged them.
He fundamentally underestimated the hidden, entrenched conservatism of human nature. He ignored the fact that people will endure an inefficient, corrupt system if it feels familiar, but they will violently reject an efficient system if it plunges them into an existential void.
And the caroms start happening immediately. When you create that level of societal anxiety, when you destroy the comforting rituals, that panic boils beneath the surface. And human nature dictates that the panicked masses will look for a single face to blame for their dread. The reformer always becomes the scapegoat.
By 1536, the billiard table is in total chaos. Massive, armed uprisings break out in the north of England, the Pilgrimage of Grace. Hundreds of thousands of furious citizens march against the crown.
And they aren't just protesting taxes.
No, they are marching under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of their familiar Catholic rituals. The rebellion is so vast and so well organized that it legitimately threatens to topple Henry from his throne.
And Henry is sitting there watching his kingdom catch fire, thinking, I just wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Thomas, why are there peasant armies marching on London? Henry manages to suppress the rebellions through false promises and brutal military force, but the experience terrifies him. He realizes the true cost of Cromwell's speed. Henry realizes he has spooked the cat.
So what does the king do? He starts frantically putting the old furniture back into the house. Henry begins a rapid backpedaling campaign. He passes the 6 Articles, which essentially reinstate many of the familiar Catholic sacraments and rituals that Cromwell had just outlawed. Henry is trying to recreate the smells of the past to calm the populace.
And Cromwell is watching this reversal with growing dread. He knows he has become the lightning rod for the nation's hatred. He knows his influence with Henry is slipping rapidly. The conservative factions at court who despise Cromwell's low birth and radical ideas are circling him like sharks.
Cromwell realizes he needs a massive win to secure his position. He decides on one desperate, final gamble. By 1540, Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, has died, and the king is in the market for a 4th wife. Cromwell decides he will play matchmaker.
He finds Anne of Cleves.
Right, Anne of Cleves, a German princess. Crucially for Cromwell, her family is aligned with the Protestant cause. If he can bind Henry to a Protestant alliance through marriage, Cromwell believes his reforms and his own neck will be safe.
But Henry has to agree to the match. So Cromwell hires Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the greatest painters of the age, to travel to Germany and paint Anne's portrait. Holbein understands the assignment. He produces a highly idealized, incredibly flattering portrait of the princess. It softens her features. It captures a serene, alluring beauty.
And Henry takes one look at the painting, falls head over heels, and agrees to the marriage sight unseen. Cromwell breathes a sigh of relief. He thinks he has sunk the winning shot.
But eventually, the physical reality has to collide with the manufactured expectation. When Anne of Cleves actually arrives in England, Henry rushes to meet her in disguise, expecting a romantic encounter with the beauty from the painting.
And it is an unmitigated disaster. Henry is physically repulsed by her. He finds her utterly unattractive, lacking the sophisticated courtly graces he expects. He tries to back out of the marriage, but the diplomatic treaties are already signed. He's forced to go through with the wedding ceremony to a woman he cannot stand.
This is the final carom, the billiard ball scratches. Henry's fury first over the chaotic, bloody reforms that nearly cost him his crown, and now over being humiliated and trapped in a loveless marriage by his ambitious minister, it just cannot be contained. He needs a scapegoat to purge the tension.
In June of 1540, the architect of the English Reformation is attending a routine council meeting. The captain of the guard steps forward and arrests Thomas Cromwell.
And the charges are a masterclass in political irony. The man who orchestrated the violent shift toward Protestantism is charged with being a radical Protestant heretic who planned to marry the king's daughter and usurp the throne. He is thrown into the Tower of London.
He is given no trial. He's condemned by a bill of attainder, and just a few weeks later, he is led out to Tower Hill. The text notes a chilling detail. The crowd that gathered to watch his execution was massive, and they were enthusiastic. They cheered wildly as the executioner's axe fell. They were cheering for the death of the man who had stolen their comforting rituals.
It is such a brutal, definitive end. And what really strikes me about this story is that Cromwell's failure wasn't his central thesis. The idea to break with Rome actually shaped the destiny of the British Empire for centuries to come. His vision won in the long run. His failure was entirely one of pacing and psychological empathy. He forced the unvarnished future down the throats of the public without offering any sweetener. He demanded they live in the void.
The text is explicit in its warning. Never underestimate the hidden conservatism of those around you. It is a powerful, entrenched force. You cannot wrench people into the future through painful, abrupt changes, no matter how logical your data is. If you destroy their psychological anchors, they will rebel and they will demand your head.
I want you to apply this directly to your own experience. Have you ever stepped into a leadership role, maybe taking over a new department or becoming the head of a community organization, and immediately decided to overhaul the entire operational structure because it was visibly inefficient?
It happens all the time.
Did you rip out the old software, fire the legacy vendors, and change the meeting structures all in your first 30 days? And what happened? Did you find yourself becoming the scapegoat? Did all the underlying anxiety, gossip, and resentment suddenly point directly at you? That is the Cromwell effect. You hit the ball too hard.
It is the inherent danger of using the blunt instrument of logic against the delicate web of human habit. Cromwell's fatal error was destroying the past to make room for the future.
Okay, so if Cromwell's brute force approach gets you executed, how do you actually dismantle an ancient system without triggering that existential panic? Is it even possible to enact radical change safely? Let's turn our attention to a historical figure who executed this law with terrifying perfection. If Cromwell is the cautionary tale of what not to do, our next subject is a masterclass in wearing the past like a comforting costume.
We are shifting our focus to the 20th century to examine Mao Zedong and his orchestration of the Communist Revolution in China. We are going to analyze his strategies precisely as they are presented in the text as an objective, tactical study of immense psychological manipulation and historical maneuvering.
Absolutely. We are dissecting the mechanics of how he achieved one of the largest societal shifts in human history without endorsing the ideology itself. Let's set the scene, because the obstacle Mao faced makes Cromwell's challenge look simple by comparison. We are in the 1920s in China. Mao is helping to build a fledgling communist party.
And their prospects are, objectively, abysmal.
Yeah.
They are a tiny faction. They have incredibly limited financial resources. They are vastly outnumbered by the nationalist forces. They lack sophisticated military experience, and their weaponry is almost non-existent.
They are the ultimate underdogs. The only mathematical path to victory is to win the absolute devotion of China's immense, sprawling peasant population. But here is the massive psychological wall they hit. Who on the face of the earth was more conservative, more deeply entrenched in the rhythms of tradition than the rural Chinese peasantry of the 1920s?
What's fascinating here is the sheer weight of the history involved. You are dealing with a civilization whose cultural continuity stretches back millennia. The bedrock of the society was the philosophy of Confucius, who lived in the 6th century BC.
2,000 years prior.
Yes.
Yeah.
More than 2,000 years later, Confucian values still dictated every interaction. It was a society built on strict, immutable hierarchies, the absolute authority of the father over the son, the older over the younger, the ruler over the subject.
Filial piety wasn't just a nice idea, it was the organizing principle of the universe. Now, into this deeply rigid ancient structure walks a group of young revolutionaries preaching Marxism-Leninism. They are proposing a radical foreign ideology that advocates the complete dismantling of class structures, the upending of property rights, and the destruction of the very hierarchies the peasants base their lives on.
From the peasant's perspective, communism isn't a political theory. It is the ultimate void. It is a terrifying abstract rupture in the fabric of their reality. Even if their current lives under the landlords were brutal and oppressive, the familiar suffering of the known world is almost always preferable to the terrifying uncertainty of a completely alien system.
Better the devil you know.
Exactly. Mao realized very early on that he could not play the Cromwell card. He couldn't just march into a village, burn the ancestral shrines, hand them a translated copy of Das Kapital, and expect them to embrace the new logic.
He understood the cat. He knew he had to keep the smells of the past alive. The text describes Mao's overarching solution as a simple deception, but the execution of it was incredibly complex. He decided that the radical future had to be presented as a glorious return to the past. He achieved this through 4 distinct, brilliant strategies of historical manipulation.
Let's break down the mechanics of the first strategy, the bandit heroes. Mao had to figure out how to legitimize a guerrilla army in the eyes of a population that prized order and hierarchy above all else.
Mao was an avid reader, and his favorite book was a wildly popular medieval Chinese novel called The Water Margin. To put it in Western terms, it is essentially the Chinese equivalent of the Robin Hood legend. It is an epic tale detailing the exploits of a band of righteous robbers and outlaws who retreat to a marshland stronghold to fight against a corrupt, evil monarch and his abusive officials.
Now, consider the psychological genius of utilizing this specific story. In strict Confucianism, your primary loyalty is to your blood family and the patriarchal hierarchy. But the Water Margin tapped into a parallel, deeply beloved cultural vein.
A different kind of loyalty.
Right. It elevated the fraternal bond between sworn brothers fighting for a noble cause. It celebrated the righteous outlaw who protected the common people when the official system failed.
Everyone loves an underdog story, especially one they grew up hearing. So what does Mao do? He doesn't present his Red Army as a vanguard of the international proletariat, a concept that meant absolutely nothing to a rice farmer. Instead, he meticulously casts his revolutionary army as the modern-day incarnation of the bandit heroes from the Water Margin.
He deliberately drew parallels in his speeches and writings. He framed the communist struggle not as a new Marxist invention, but as the natural, inevitable continuation of the timeless Chinese narrative of the righteous peasant rebellion against corrupt overlords. He gave the peasants a familiar framework to understand this new, terrifying army.
He wrapped them in mythology.
By wrapping his soldiers in the mythology of beloved folk heroes, he gave the conservative peasantry the psychological permission to support them.
It's the old blanket in the new house. He's saying, we are destroying your culture. We are the heroes from your favorite cultural story come to life. And this leads directly to strategy 2, the poet warrior. Because it wasn't just the army that needed a historical costume. Mao himself needed one.
Once the party began to gain momentum and eventually took power, Mao faced a leadership dilemma. He could not present himself in the mold of a Soviet leader. The aesthetic of a Chinese Lenin, a stark, modern, bureaucratic revolutionary, would feel alien and abrasive to the Chinese masses. They had a deep-seated, culturally ingrained expectation of what supreme leadership looked like.
For thousands of years, they were ruled by emperors who demanded a reverence that bordered on the divine. The people were psychologically accustomed to a grand patriarchal figure.
So Mao simply filled the existing void, but he chose a very specific historical avatar to legitimize his new role. He cast himself in the mold of Zhuge Liang.
This is such a fascinating historical pull. Zhuge Liang was a real historical 3rd century military strategist who became a massive, legendary figure in another great Chinese epic, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
But Zhuge Liang wasn't just a brute force general. His legend was built on being a multifaceted genius. He was a brilliant tactician, yes, but he was also a poet, a deep philosophical thinker, and a man of unyielding moral rectitude. He was the archetype of the philosopher warrior.
And Mao completely adopts this persona. He writes poetry, he publishes philosophical treatises, he presents himself not merely as a political dictator, but as a stern, wise father figure dispensing both military victory and moral instruction. He provides the masses with the exact type of patriarchal, sweeping authority figure they unconsciously crave, just slightly updated for the 20th century.
Oh, it was brilliant.
He was preaching the new ethics of communism, but he was delivering it through the incredibly familiar vessel of the ancient sage king.
Which brings us to strategy 3, where Mao tackles the messy reality of actually governing and the violence required to maintain control. This is the strategy of reinterpreting the dictator. Mao looks back to the 3rd century BC, to the reign of Emperor Qin.
Emperor Qin is a colossal figure in Chinese history. On one hand, his achievements are unparalleled. He is the man who first unified the warring states into a single empire. He initiated the building of the Great Wall. The very name China is derived from his dynasty.
However, his historical legacy was notoriously dark. To achieve that unification, Qin was an extraordinarily brutal dictator. He violently suppressed dissent, he executed scholars, and famously, he ordered the burning of the works of Confucius to erase the past. His reign was short, bloody, and traditionally viewed with a mix of awe and terror.
Most politicians would run from comparisons to a tyrant who burned books. But Mao leans into it. In his speeches, his writings, and his public pronouncements, Mao deliberately and repeatedly likens himself to Emperor Qin. He says to the people, look at what Qin accomplished. He unified a fractured land. He built a great wall to protect us from foreign invaders. Like Qin, I am unifying a broken China. Like Qin, I must take bold, aggressive action against the oppressive remnants of the past to secure our future.
Notice the brilliance of the manipulation here. He is performing a dual historical trick. First, he is actively rehabilitating the image of Emperor Qin in the minds of the contemporary public, reframing the ancient dictator's brutality as necessary strength. And second, by firmly associating himself with this newly justified historical titan, Mao is using the past to validate the violence and the sweeping, painful reforms of his own new order.
He justifies the present hardship.
He is telling the masses, the hardship you're experiencing now is not a communist aberration. It is the grand, traditional price of Chinese greatness, just as it was 2,000 years ago.
He takes the anxiety of the present and neutralizes it by anchoring it in the epic past. And this mastery of historical manipulation culminates in Strategy 4. This happens later, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, after the immense upheaval of the Cultural Revolution. Mao finds himself locked in a bitter, high-stakes power struggle with his own defense minister, Lin Piao.
Now, at its core, this is a very standard, somewhat banal political turf war. It is two powerful men maneuvering for control of the military and the state apparatus in the backrooms of Beijing.
But Mao knows that a backroom bureaucratic struggle doesn't inspire the masses. He needs to mobilize the youth to purge Lin Piao's influence. But how do you get millions of teenagers to care about a dispute between two old men over administrative control? You have to elevate the conflict. You have to make it mythic.
Mao observes that Lin Piao has a habit of occasionally quoting Confucius in his writings and speeches. Mao seizes on this tiny detail and uses it to construct a massive, nationwide propaganda narrative. Mao publicly casts Lin Piao not as a political rival, but as the literal modern embodiment of Confucius himself.
And remember, in the context of Mao's revolution, what does Confucius represent? Confucius is the ultimate symbol of the stagnant, oppressive, hierarchical past that the revolution is trying to escape.
So if Lin Piao is the avatar of Confucius, who is Mao, Mao aligns himself with an ancient philosophical school known as legalism, specifically the writings of a philosopher named Han Fei-tzu.
The legalists were the ancient intellectual rivals of the Confucians. They disdained the soft ethics of filial piety. They believed that humans were inherently selfish and that a strong state required absolute power, strict laws, and the willingness to use violence to forge a new order.
Mao takes this complex, ancient philosophical debate and turns it into a modern, comic book-level showdown. He unleashes a colossal media campaign across the entire country, the progressive, strong legalists versus the weak, regressive Confucians. He tells the youth of China, this isn't a fight about government posts. This is the eternal struggle for the soul of China. Lin Piao wants to drag you back into the oppressive past of your ancestors. I am leading you toward the powerful, legalist future.
Think about the mechanics of how this worked on the ground. He handed angry, energetic teenagers an ancient philosophical text and told them that rebelling against their elders, their teachers, and Lin Piao's faction was actually the fulfillment of a grand historical destiny. He weaponized their natural rebellious energy by cloaking it in the ultimate historical authority. He enveloped a mundane turf war in an epic cosmic narrative, and the youth mobilized exactly as he intended.
But the text provides a vital piece of context that explains why Mao was so rigorous about wearing the costume of the past. He wasn't born with this insight. He learned it through a catastrophic failure.
Ah, the great leap forward.
Yes. In the late 1950s, Mao attempted to force rapid, massive industrialization and agricultural collectivization on the country. During the Great Leap Forward, he abandoned the historical cloaks. He demanded a radical, immediate break with the past, trying to wrench the peasantry directly into a utopian Marxist future through sheer force of will.
He acted exactly like Thomas Cromwell. He hit the billiard ball with maximum violence.
And the Kirams were devastating. The resulting systemic collapse and famine caused unimaginable tragedy and tens of millions of deaths. The text points out that Mao absorbed a profound lesson from this catastrophe. He never repeated the mistake of demanding a naked break with tradition. From that point forward, he understood the absolute law of the cat radical change. If it is to survive, must wear the comfortable, familiar clothes of the past.
Okay, we have covered the Tudor executioner and the 20th century revolutionary, but I can hear you, the listener, asking a very practical question right now. This is fascinating history, but I'm not trying to overthrow the Catholic Church or mobilize a guerrilla army. How do I actually apply this? What does this mean for me in my office or in my community when I just want to implement a better way of doing things?
It is the perfect transition. We need to distill these grand geopolitical maneuvers into practical mechanics. The text outlines specific historical tactics for enacting what it calls a con game of change. How do you actually manufacture the illusion of continuity while quietly rewriting the rules?
Let's open up the toolkit of the institutional con. Tactic number one is perhaps my favorite because the audacity is just breathtaking, tinkering with dead texts. And to illustrate this, we look at another Chinese figure, Emperor Wang Mang.
Wang Mang took power in 88 during a period of intense social and economic instability. The empire was fracturing, the people were exhausted by corruption, and there was a desperate, palpable yearning for a return to order. And in the Chinese cultural consciousness, the absolute gold standard of order was, once again, the teachings of Confucius.
But here is the historical wrinkle. As we mentioned earlier, Emperor Qin had ordered the vast majority of Confucian texts burned 2 centuries prior. The actual writings were largely lost to history, existing only in fragments and oral traditions.
So the people revere Confucius, but they don't actually have his complete rulebook. Wang Mang is a reformer. He has a suite of radical progressive changes he wants to implement regarding land ownership and the abolition of slavery. But he knows that if he simply announces, "I am changing the laws," the conservative nobility will destroy him. He needs an unassailable authority to back him up.
And then, miraculously, a major historical discovery occurs. Word spreads throughout the capital that scholars have unearthed a cache of perfectly preserved original Confucian texts hidden beneath the walls of an ancient estate, surviving the fires of Emperor Qin.
The timing is incredibly convenient.
It is the ultimate political convenience. Now, Wang Mang immediately confiscates these newly discovered texts for safekeeping, but he doesn't just publish them. He gathers his most trusted scribes in secret. And before releasing these texts to the public, Wang Mang has his scribes meticulously forge and insert entirely new passages into the ancient documents.
And what do these newly discovered passages of ancient wisdom say?
They specifically, explicitly outline and endorse the exact land reforms and policies that Wang Mang wants to implement. He writes his own political platform into the mouth of the greatest sage in history. When the texts are finally published, the people read them and say, well, we have to redistribute the land. The great Confucius commanded it. The opposition is completely silenced. You can't argue with the divine past.
The lesson the text draws from Wang Mang is profound for anyone trying to enact change. The past is a dead text. The people who lived it are gone. It is a corpse that you can prop up and manipulate. Because people naturally revere the past, you can safely insert your own lines into it.
Think about how often this happens today. Think about modern political debates. How often do you hear a politician confidently declare, the Founding Fathers intended for this specific internet regulation to exist, or Abraham Lincoln would have supported this tax policy? They are doing exactly what Wang Mang did. They are taking a dead text, an unarguable historical authority, and inserting their modern agenda into it to make the new change feel rooted in sacred tradition.
It is an incredibly effective way to bypass critical resistance. Which leads us seamlessly into tactic 2, keeping the numbers and titles. If Wang Mang manipulated texts, this tactic is about manipulating the visual architecture of power. We turn to an observation from Niccolo Machiavelli, the ultimate anatomist of power.
Machiavelli was obsessed with how the ancient Romans managed public psychology. He looked specifically at the moment when Rome underwent a massive violent revolution, transitioning from a monarchy ruled by kings to a republic ruled by elected officials.
This is a moment of maximum psychological peril for a society. You are entirely destroying the central pillar of authority. The potential for the void to induce mass panic is astronomical.
The founders of the Republic knew they had to kill the king's power, but they realized they couldn't just erase the visual symbols of the king without terrifying the populace. They had to maintain what we might call the visual math of safety.
Explain how they maintain that math.
Consider the king's bodyguards. Traditionally, the Roman king was accompanied in public by 12 lictors. These were ceremonial guards carrying the symbols of state power. It was a visual anchor. When the king walked by, you saw 12 lictors, and you knew the world was in order. When the Republic abolished the king and replaced him with 2 elected consuls, they had a choice. They could have given the consuls 5 guards or 50, but they didn't. Machiavelli notes that they assigned exactly 12 lictors to the consuls.
When the average Roman citizen looked up at the new government, the silhouette looked exactly the same. The visual math added it to 12.
Precisely. And it expanded to the religious rituals. The king had always performed a specific, highly important annual sacrifice. The public loved this ritual. It was a cornerstone of their year. The Republic didn't want a king, but they couldn't cancel the sacrifice without causing an uproar. So what did they do? They created a new, powerless, bureaucratic position specifically to perform the ceremony, and they officially titled the role the King of the Sacrifice.
They kept the title. They gutted the actual political power of the word king, but they left the acoustic shell of the word intact to soothe the masses. Machiavelli concludes that these gestures, however hollow they seem to us, completely satisfied the Roman people. They were given the comforting semblance of the old forms, which prevented them from panicking and demanding the return of an actual monarch.
They kept the scratching post in the exact same corner of the room, even though they changed the entire house. And this mastery of appearances brings us to tactic 3, the illusion of tradition. Let's look at a family that built an empire on this concept, the Medici family in Renaissance Florence.
Florence in the 14th and 15th centuries was an incredibly proud, fiercely independent republic. They had centuries of tradition built around councils, voting, and the prevention of tyranny. They were deeply suspicious of anyone who displayed too much ambition or acted like nobility.
Enter Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo possesses immense wealth from his banking empire, and he has a singular goal. He wants to bring the entire Republic of Florence under the absolute dictatorial control of his family. He wants to be a king in all but name.
If Cosimo had acted like a traditional conqueror, if he had marched into the city square, disbanded the Republican councils, and declared himself Duke of Florence, the citizens would have assassinated him before sunset.
So Cosimo executes the ultimate illusion of tradition. He never claims a grand title, he dresses relatively modestly, he walks the streets like a common citizen, and most importantly, he makes incredibly loud, highly public displays of his enthusiastic support for the Republic's ancient traditions. He funds the guilds, he publicly praises the council system. He appears to be the ultimate zealot for the old Republican ways.
But the reality beneath the surface was entirely different. While he was loudly praising the Republic in public, quietly behind the scenes, he was completely gutting its actual power. He used his vast wealth to buy the debts of key politicians, ensuring that only men loyal to the Medici were elected to the councils.
In form, the Medici retained the perfect appearance of a republic. The voting still happened, the ceremonies were still held, the titles remained the same. But in substance, the republic was an empty shell, entirely directed by Cosimo's will. He enacted a radical, total regime change, transferring power from the people to a single family, while appearing to be the great safeguard of tradition. He gave them the appearance of liberty, which is often all people truly require.
Let's distill these 3 tactics into a modern, practical application. We aren't suggesting you forge historical documents or dismantle democracies. We are talking about reducing the psychological friction of change in your daily life. Let's say you are an IT director and you are tasked with overhauling a company's entire software infrastructure. The legacy system is dangerous, it's prone to crashing, and it is holding the company back.
But the employees cling to the old system. They know where the buttons are, they know the quirks, it's their sensory map.
Exactly. If you send out a memo that says, we are deleting the old software on Friday, on Monday, you will log into this completely alien, hyper-modern interface with all new terminology, you will face an absolute rebellion. Productivity will plummet to 0. People will actively sabotage the new system because they feel stupid and disoriented. You have thrown them into the void.
So how do you use the Medici and Machiavelli tactics to roll out the software safely?
You meticulously preserve the visual math and the titles. If the old broken software called the main department folders hubs, you make absolutely sure the new software also calls them hubs, even if directories is technically more accurate. You ask the developers to skin the new interface using the exact same color palette as the old system. You ensure the submit button is in the exact same quadrant of the screen.
You keep the 12 lictors.
You keep the 12 lictors. You are enacting a massive, necessary change. You are moving their data to the cloud. You're securing the company, but you are wrapping that radical new reality in the comforting, familiar skin of the old reality. You are satisfying them with appearances, allowing them to feel competent and safe while you lead them into the future.
I think when we discuss these tactics, there is a natural tendency for the listener to think, okay, this makes sense for Renaissance peasants or ancient Romans or maybe stubbornly non-technical coworkers resisting a software update. But surely in realms of pure logic, in the hard sciences, in the pursuit of high-level truth, this doesn't apply. Surely rationality wins out over habit in the minds of geniuses.
That is one of the most pervasive and dangerous illusions we hold, the illusion of scientific objectivity. We desperately want to believe that the scientific community is a pure meritocracy of ideas, immune to the irrationality of the cat.
But the text shatters that illusion completely. It points us toward the absolute heavyweights of scientific history. Charles Darwin, when he published his theories on evolution and natural selection, Jonas Salk with his radical innovations in immunology and the polio vaccine. Max Planck, who literally tore down classical physics to establish quantum theory. The text points out a shocking historical reality. All of these visionaries face significantly fiercer, more vicious opposition from their fellow scientists than they ever did from religious authorities or the general public.
And we have to ask why. Why would brilliant scientists attack a superior, mathematically sound theory? Because Darwin and Planck didn't just introduce a new piece of data into an existing framework.
Yeah.
They introduced paradigm shifts that entirely destroyed the life's work of the established scientific community.
They destroyed the sensory map of the physics department.
Exactly. Imagine you have spent 30 years building your prestigious career, publishing papers, and earning accolades based on classical Newtonian physics. Suddenly, a young Max Planck comes along and proves that the foundational assumptions of your entire reality are fundamentally flawed. He isn't just proving you wrong, he is rendering your life's work obsolete. He has plunged you into the professional void.
And the reaction is identical to the cat losing its furniture. They lash out. They don't attack the data, they attack the man. There is a quote from Max Planck highlighted in the text that is incredibly brutal, but it reveals the absolute truth of human nature. Planck wrote about the vicious scientific opposition he faced, and he concluded, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it."
I want the listener to really absorb the gravity of that admission. Planck is saying that even the most brilliant, highly educated, rationally trained minds on planet Earth cannot be wrenched into a new paradigm by facts alone. The psychological anchor of the familiar is so strong that it literally requires the old guard to die off before the new truth can become the familiar warmth for the next generation.
So what is the actionable takeaway for you, the listener, if you work in tech or STEM or any highly rational, data-driven field? The takeaway is that you cannot rely on being right. Being right is not enough. You still have to play the courtier's game. The text advises looking at how Galileo operated early in his career.
Galileo was brilliant at this. He didn't just drop radical discoveries on the table and insult the old guard. He paid lip service to tradition. He framed his new astronomical discoveries as mere extensions of older, accepted philosophies.
He wrapped the telescope in the old blanket. If you have a revolutionary idea, you must identify the elements of your theory that can be made to seem like they build respectfully upon the past. Make a show of conformity. Cite the established figures. Use the accepted terminology. Respect the protocol of the institution and let your radical theories do their transformative work quietly, beneath the surface of unquestioned tradition.
Which brings us to perhaps the most spectacular large-scale application of this law in human history. We've talked about politics, we've talked about software, and we've talked about quantum physics. Let's look at the ultimate historical con game of change. Let's look at how the biggest religious movement in history disguised its takeover.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's dive into the text's sidebar on the history of Christmas. Because if you want to understand how to completely rewire a society's belief system without triggering a revolt, you have to look at the month of December.
To understand the brilliance of what the early church did, we have to establish the immense psychological gravity of the winter solstice in the ancient world.
Across almost all Northern Hemisphere cultures, the end of December is the darkest, coldest, most terrifying time of the year. The days grow incredibly short, the crops are dead, and primitive man legitimately feared that the sun might simply continue to shrink and never return. Therefore, the period surrounding the winter solstice became the focal point for massive, deeply emotional, deeply entrenched rituals designed to evoke light, warmth, and the promise of the sun's rebirth.
For the Romans, this manifested as the Saturnalia, celebrated between December 17th and 23rd. It honors Saturn, the god of agriculture and time.
And the text describes the Saturnalia as the absolute pinnacle of the Roman year. It was the most cheerful, chaotic festival imaginable. All normal business ceased, schools closed, the courts shut down. It was a carnival atmosphere that temporarily inverted the strict social order. Slaves were allowed to wear their master's clothes and sit at the head of the table. People decorated their doorways with evergreen laurel branches. They visited each other's homes, feasted wildly, and exchanged specific gifts, mostly wax candles to symbolize the return of light, and small clay figurines.
But it wasn't just the Romans. If you look further north, the Germanic and Nordic peoples held massive, roaring winter solstice festivals, centering around the Yule log, honoring the rebirth of the sun and their great pagan gods like Wotan, Freyja, and Donar, who we know today as Thor. In the Middle East, long before the birth of Christ, the Jewish people celebrated an 8-day festival of lights around this exact same season.
You have this massive, pan-cultural, incredibly deep-rooted emotional attachment to midwinter celebrations. It is the ultimate comforting ritual. Now, fast forward to the 4th century, AD, Emperor Constantine has legalized Christianity, and the new church is trying to establish dominance across the Roman Empire. But the church encounters a massive, immovable obstacle.
The people are willing to be baptized, but they absolutely refuse to give up their midwinter festivals. The Church Fathers initially tried to ban the Saturnalia and the solstice fires, decrying them as pagan abominations, but the people ignored the bans. The rituals were too deeply ingrained in their sensory map of the year. The Church realized that if they acted like Thomas Cromwell and tried to smash the traditions by force, they would face massive, unending revolts. The new religion would be rejected as a joyless void.
So the church looks for a workaround. And the historical stage is perfectly set by a previous Roman emperor named Aurelian. In the year AD 274, Aurelian was trying to unify the fracturing Roman legions. The legions were obsessed with a god named Mithras. Mithras was an ancient Aryan god of light, a bringer of victory, fertility, and peace. Aurelian officially established the cult of the unconquered sun, and he declared a national holiday to celebrate the birthday of Mithras.
And the date Aurelian chose for the birthday of the sun god?
December 25th. Right at the culmination of the Saturnalia and the solstice celebrations. It was a wildly popular holiday.
So we arrive at the year AD 354. The Christian Church, under the leadership of Pope Liberius, makes a decision of staggering strategic brilliance. They stop fighting the winter festivals, they don't ban the wax candles, they don't burn the laurel branches, and they don't stop the feasting on December 25th. They execute the ultimate institutional acquisition.
Pope Liberius simply declares that going forward, December 25th is the official birthday of Jesus Christ.
It is the flawless execution of Law 45. They didn't fight the deeply entrenched winter rituals, they just changed the title on the door.
It is Emperor Wang Mang inserting his text into the ancient scrolls, but executed on a global millennial scale. The church leaders said to the pagans, "Keep your evergreens, keep your candles, keep your midwinter feasts and your gift-giving. We are just asking you to direct those familiar feelings of joy and rebirth toward a new historical figure." They kept the exact same visual math, the exact same sensory experiences, but subtly shifted the spiritual allegiance beneath the surface.
And the deception worked so perfectly, it is almost unfathomable. They successfully co-opted the pagan emotional anchors. Thousands of years later, modern people still drag evergreen trees into their living rooms, light candles, and exchange gifts in the dead of winter without ever once thinking about the Roman god Saturn or the Aryan god Mithras.
It is the ultimate proof that if you want a radical change to endure for centuries, you must meticulously design it to feel as though it has always been there.
Now, I think it is important we pause the historical narrative here to address a critical nuance. We have spent this entire deep dive hammering home the absolute necessity of using the past, of cloaking your changes in tradition, and maintaining the familiar smells for the cat. But a strategic mind must always ask, are there exceptions to the rule? Is there ever a scenario where associating your new movement with the past is actually a terrible idea?
Right. What if the old house was on fire? Does the cat still want the old blanket?
Exactly. The text provides a very specific, crucial reversal to this law. The overarching rule is that the past is a corpse you can manipulate to provide comfort. But there is one major exception. If the recent past was universally experienced as painful, harsh, and traumatic, then associating yourself with it is completely self-destructive.
If the familiar smell is the scent of a predator, you do not bring it into the new house.
Precisely. To illustrate this exception, the text points us to the aftermath of the French Revolution, specifically the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Consider the psychological state of the French populace when Napoleon seizes power as first consul in 1799.
The nation is deeply traumatized. They have just survived a decade of unimaginable chaos. The reign of terror saw thousands of people publicly beheaded by the guillotine. The streets had literally run with blood, and the catalyst for all of that horrific violence was the searing memory of the Bourbon monarchy.
Specifically, the lavish, ostentatious, wildly excessive court of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The glittering luxury of Versailles while the peasants starved was the primary trigger for the national trauma.
So Napoleon takes power. He is essentially a dictator, and eventually he will crown himself emperor. If he had followed a superficial reading of Law 45, he might have tried to establish legitimacy by recreating the glamorous, highly ritualized court of the old French monarchs. He might have thought, the people miss the grandeur of the monarchy, I will give them Versailles 2.0.
If he had tried to use that specific traumatic recent past to legitimize his rule, the public would have recoiled in horror. It would have triggered massive cultural PTSD. His own courtiers would have spent all their time looking over their shoulders, terrified that the guillotine was coming back.
Yeah.
Recreating the Bourbon court would have sparked a second revolution instantly.
So Napoleon had to invent a new aesthetic of power. How did he do it?
He established a court that was remarkable for its absolute sobriety. It completely lacked the powdered wigs, the absurd excesses, and the paralyzing etiquette of the Bourbon kings. Instead, Napoleon built the court of a working general. It was disciplined, it elevated military virtues, merit, and hard work. It was austere and functional.
And to a traumatized nation sick of both royal excess and revolutionary chaos, that sober, functional new form felt deeply appropriate. It was reassuring in its starkness. But, and this is the vital caveat the text emphasizes, even though Napoleon made a bold, necessary break from the traumatic recent past, he did not violate the core rule of human psychology. He didn't just tear down the old system and leave a vacuum.
He knew that a vacuum is still terrifying. Even an ugly recent history seems preferable to an empty space to the human animal.
So what does Napoleon do? He fills the empty space immediately with a barrage of new rituals and structures. He establishes the Legion of Honor to reward merit, creating a new hierarchy. He implements the Napoleonic Code, completely rewriting the legal system, but giving people immediate, predictable rules to live by. He created a new bank, a new educational system. He threw out the old blood-soaked scratching post, but he bolted a brand new one to the floor before the cat had time to panic.
He manufactured a new routine so quickly that it instantly became the new familiar. Now, if we connect this dynamic of the new to our modern world, the text issues a profound warning about what it calls the trap of the cutting edge.
Oh, this is incredibly relevant today. Look at the industries that dominate our culture: tech, fashion, modern art, and media. In those worlds, it seems like making a radical rupture with the past is the entire goal. Disruption isn't just a buzzword, it's practically a religion. Everyone wants to be the visionary who breaks the mold entirely, who burns down the old establishment and offers something utterly unprecedented.
And the text acknowledges the allure of that path. It concedes that appearing fiercely cutting edge can, temporarily, bring you a tremendous amount of attention and power, but it cautions the listener. That specific type of power is incredibly tenuous. It is built on sand.
Why is it so fragile?
Because if your entire brand identity, your sole source of leverage, is built on the claim, I am the newest thing, I am a total break from the past, you have established a game you cannot win in the long term. You have no foundational roots. It is an absolute certainty that someone younger, fresher, more radical, and more shocking will come along tomorrow and outdo you.
The bold, shocking innovation that makes you famous today becomes the tiresome, tame baseline of tomorrow. It is the treadmill of novelty. If you completely cut ties with the past, you condemn yourself to a lifetime of running on that treadmill, forever playing a stressful, exhausting game of catch-up, trying to outshock the next generation.
Exactly. The text argues that true, lasting, unshakable power, even in highly creative, innovative fields, doesn't come from destroying tradition. It comes from tinkering with tradition. It comes from deeply understanding convention so that you can elegantly subvert it. Why? Because periods of dizzying radical change merely disguise a fundamental truth. The human yearning for the comfort of the past will inevitably always creep back in. If your creation, no matter how innovative, has some invisible root tapping into the past, it will resonate on a deeper psychological level. It will have more than a momentary appeal. It will endure.
So, trying to completely sever yourself from history is not just arrogant, it is a futile, self-destructive endeavor. It is like trying to design a building while pretending gravity doesn't exist. Human psychology is the gravity.
Which brings us back to the core lesson of this entire exploration.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize the vast timeline we've covered today. We started with a fundamental paradox. Change is absolutely necessary. Institutions rot. Processes become inefficient. You have to adapt to survive. But the human animal requires the illusion of continuity to avoid sheer existential panic. You have to move forward without letting the people feel the motion.
Whether you are Thomas Cromwell losing your head because you hit the billiard ball of reform with arrogant, blinding force, or Mao Zedong successfully reshaping the destiny of a billion people by pretending to be an ancient, sword-wielding poet, the underlying rule remains immutable. You cannot fight the cat.
The zeitgeist dictates your strategy. You have to learn how to read the emotional room of history. As the text brilliantly summarizes, if you find yourself leading people during a tumultuous time, when anxiety is high and foundations are shaking, there is immense power to be gained by preaching a return to the past. Be the anchor. Offer comfort, tradition, and the reassuring rituals of history. But if you find yourself mired in a period of stagnation where the old ways are suffocating progress, you must play the card of reform. You must be the revolutionary.
But, and this is the crucial, life-saving but that separates the successful visionaries from the martyrs, you must disguise that revolution. You must sweeten the poison of the new with the honey of the old. Understand that those who brazenly start a revolution are rarely the ones who survive to finish it, unless they possess the empathy and the cunning to play with appearances.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to bring this history out of the textbooks and place it directly into your lap. We've spent the last hour dissecting the power plays of ancient Rome, Tudor England, Renaissance Florence, and 1920s China. But this dynamic isn't trapped in the past. It is happening all around you, right at this very second, in the most mundane aspects of your life. Think about the incredible, dizzying velocity of change happening in our modern world. Think about the smartphone resting in your pocket, or the artificial intelligence interfaces that are currently overhauling how your industry functions.
This is where we see the ultimate invisible modern application of keeping the smells of the past alive. Look at your computer screen right now. You are interacting with lines of complex code, massive server farms in the desert, and microchips processing billions of calculations a second. It is a completely alien, hyper-futuristic environment. But what do you actually see on your screen? You see files. You see manila folders. You see a desktop. You chat in rooms. When you want to delete a piece of code, you drag it into a little digital trash can.
Oh, wow, that is so true.
These are incredibly comforting relics. They are the visual ghosts of physical office spaces that haven't actually operated that way in decades. The tech giants who built your reality know exactly what they're doing. They are Wang Mang inserting texts. They are Machiavelli keeping the 12 lictors. They are wrapping the terrifying void of the digital age in the comforting analog blanket of the past.
Wow.
So my final provocative thought for you to mull over as you navigate your week is this. Look closely at the systems, the new technologies, and the institutional changes being rolled out in your workplace, in your life right now. Look past the shiny marketing of novelty. Ask yourself, what familiar objects are being carefully placed in your environment right now to keep you the cat from realizing that your entire world has just been irrevocably changed?
Once you start looking for the 12 lictors, once you start sniffing out the old blanket, you will see these comforting illusions absolutely everywhere. It completely changes the way you see the world. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. We hope you've gained some valuable tools for enacting change in your own life and perhaps developed a bit more empathy for the resistance you inevitably face. Keep your eyes open, keep your routines anchored, and above all, keep questioning the world around you. We'll catch you next time.